Thank you all very much for your attendance. Alex White is my name, Director General here at the Institute, and it's wonderful to see such a full house and the interest there undoubtedly is in our business of the afternoon, which is the launch of the OECD Economic Survey of Ireland 2025. So we're very pleased here at the Institute to host the event, and we've lined up along with the Department of Finance and the OECD indeed, a really, if I may say so, impressive list of participants and speakers, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank the Department of Finance and the OECD for helping us here at the Institute to put the event together. We enjoy a very close working relationship with the Department of Finance, and this is frankly exactly the kind of event that we value here at the Institute and our members value, offering the opportunity to think about, well, to track first of all and understand and think about and analyze critical economic trends domestically and internationally. So we're very pleased, as I said, to be joined by a really impressive panel. Particularly pleased to have Minister Donohoe with us. Come back to that in a moment. Minister of Finance and President of the Eurogroup. Alvaro Pereira is the OECD Chief Economist and G20 Finance Deputy, and he will present the survey to us shortly. Dr. Martina Lawless is Research Professor at the ESRI. Muge Adelaide McGowan is a Senior Economist and Head of the Japan-Ireland Desk at the OECD. And John McCarthy is Chief Economist at the Department of Finance. So as I said, Mr. Pereira, in a few minutes after the Minister makes some opening remarks, will introduce the survey, and that will be followed by a panel discussion, which is chaired by Professor Frances Éireann, who's just right beside me here. We're delighted to have you, Frances, here this afternoon yet again back at the Institute. Frances Éireann is chair of the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, and that panel discussion will last for 40 minutes or so. Just to remind everybody that today's event is being recorded, so it's on the record, and to bear that in mind. So our guest of honour, if I may describe him as such, Paschal Donohoe, is Minister for Finance and President of the Eurogroup. I saw that he was writing recently somewhere that he describes himself as the last survivor of the government of, I think, 2014 onward, the government that he joined the cabinet at the same day as I did in 2014. And he described himself as a survivor. And I think you'll all agree that Paschal Donohoe is a lot more than simply a survivor. And but that was the modest way he described himself. In fact, he and I have had sort of parallel careers, though mine, as you will appreciate, ended a lot sooner than his looks like ending. In 2004, he became a member of a local authority, same day as I did. 2007, we both ran the general election that year. We were not elected, either of us. 2009, we both ran in by-elections, he just here and me across the river in another constituency. In 2011, we were both honoured to be elected to Dáil Éireann. Subsequently, we both became chairs of Oireachtas committees in 2011. In 2012, I became Minister of State. In 2013, Paschal became Minister of State. In 2014, we both joined the government as cabinet ministers. In 2016, well, I was going to say you all know what happened to me. I certainly know what happened to me. It was the door. But Paschal, as I said, has done a lot more than simply survive. He has had and is having a most critical role in government throughout those years, and indeed internationally as president of the Eurogroup. An excellent cabinet colleague, I remember, if I may say so, just to personalise it a little. And I do remember one time, I'll just say this very briefly, coming back and with great empathy for colleagues and support, which is the kind of thing that people sometimes forget, that, you know, you're sort of, you know, you also have a certain amount of humanity associated with yourself. I mean, you're a human being as everything else. Great supporter in cabinet on the business of cabinet. But I do remember one time coming back from an interview in RT or somewhere. Sorry, RT here, I better not say it was them, but I think it was. And I imagine it was radio because it was during the day. And I was out there thinking I was doing a great thing, telling the world about broadband or something, or some great initiative that I was so pleased about and delighted about, or maybe it was air code actually, or something like that. And all the journalists wanted to do was to ask me how it was going to go wrong. It was definitely going to go wrong. What were the pitfalls? What were the problems? So, you know, the way you get 30 seconds to make your point, and then the rest of it is kind of, you know, you're dreadful and you're appalling and this is never going to work and all the rest of it. And I remember coming back into town and meeting Pat. He said, God, he said, I heard that. Like, does any good turn not go unpunished, or something like that. So a real sense of solidarity, and a really good colleague and a good guy. So I'm delighted as Director General to introduce Paschal Donohoe, Minister for Finance, President of the Eurogroup, to address you this afternoon. And when that has finished, I'm delighted that Francis Round will take up the running then with the panel. So Paschal.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex, and good afternoon to all of you. Two elements of the relationship with Alex that I want to particularly identify before, as he is still here, is the first one is that Alex and I also had one other experience that we shared, which is both of us went to Malawi as in conjunction with Trocra. And when I was out there, I had the opportunity to really get to know Alex, which leads on to my second point about him, which is what a loss he was to our Dáil and to government. Because for all of you who have worked with him in a legal career that then flourished after he left politics, and then have seen him lead the IIEA, you'll appreciate what a loss he was to those of us in public life. Because of the qualities that he so evidently possesses. So that's why it's always lovely to be here, Alex, and thank you for all the great work you do leading this really important institution here in Ireland. So with that recognition offered, I do want to move on to the more general recognition of the importance of this publication today, and also the relationship between Ireland and the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And all of the finest qualities of that organisation are evident in the rigorous, impartial analysis that they are publishing today, which is their biannual economic survey into the economy of Ireland. I want to thank all of the team who've been involved in doing this, but in particular, I want to thank my colleague, Alvaro Pereira, the Chief Economist of the OECD, for your work and your presence here today. Alvaro has many great qualities as an economist, but he's even greater qualities as a book lover. So any questions that you want to put to him later on, please do touch on the economy, but also touch on other issues of the soul, like what books he has read and any recommendations that he could offer. But hoping that we do get to that, let me just say a few words about the organisation that he's representing here today and all of his colleagues. Noting that the relationship between Ireland and the OECD now goes back to 1961. And when you read the historical records of that period and read the history of Ireland in the 1950s and into the 1960s, as our predecessors were opening up a debate regarding how we can modernise Ireland from a social and economic point of view, they saw their relationship and their membership with the OECD as one of the invaluable anchors to how Ireland could identify sources of learning, ways in which we could do better, and also to place ourselves in a framework that was far greater than just our own national horizons. And the relationship that we began with the OECD and then subsequently, and even more fundamentally, our relationship and then membership of the European Union is all about that. A recognition that through deep multilateral cooperation, turning partnerships into friendships, learning from each other in a very solid framework is at the heart of how countries come together to avail of opportunities and deal with difficulties that they couldn't do on their own. I hope and believe this has been a two-way relationship over the years, that not only have we gained, but we've also contributed, and we've done so because of our understanding of how important the OECD is and how important it is that we support their work in a world that we all know is changing so quickly. Because no country, no matter how powerful they may be, can achieve more individually than they can collectively. And organizations like the OECD offer us the best rules-based framework within which we can do that for some of our most pressing challenges. And this report lays out the strengths that they have. It provides a very comprehensive, a very rich, but also a really balanced assessment of where the economy of Ireland stands here today. And for any of you who are familiar with their work, you'll be able to see the insights they bring to bear. But I hope there are some who are perhaps a little earlier in their journey in life in thinking about economics or thinking about the economy of Ireland. And if they are, they'll see a publication from the OECD that above all is very accessible and very clear, which is really important in a world in which we're trying to bring evidence and insight and ensure the role of evidence is protected in public debates. So there's much within the report that goes into the current features of the economy. My assessment regarding where we stand is very much in line with that of the OECD. So let me just touch on some of the structural chapters that are identified in the report and some of the matters that are raised. So overall, we have an economy that continues to be in a relatively healthy position. As I look back on all of the different challenges and shocks that we have endured, I remember when Brexit happened, as I'm sure you all do, and what that could have meant for our economy. I will never forget being seated at my desk in the Department of Finance and being informed that over 600,000 people were about to become unemployed in less than 2 weeks because of the pandemic, and that we had to shut our economy down. And then similarly, we're also experienced with the effect that sharp increases of inflation had on living standards. But if you look at where we stand at the moment, it is overall a case of the value of resilience being well made. And nowhere is that clearer than where we are with regard to employment, which is again laid out in the publication today. 2.8 million people are now working in Ireland. That is 3/4 of our working age population. And I remember when I started thinking about economics in the late 1980s and studying it in secondary school, reading publications and studies that were mainly focused on structural levels of unemployment in Ireland. I remember reading a very slim book by Paul Tansey many years ago, many decades ago now, in fact, regarding why is unemployment so high in Ireland and why can't we get it down? Where we stand here today is an unemployment rate of 4.0%, the lowest in 2 decades. And within that, the share of women participating in our labour market is at its highest level ever. The youth unemployment rate remains relatively low at 11% and is well below the EU average. But with that acknowledged, what I also have to acknowledge, which we're all now keenly aware of, is the degree of change that is taking place around us. How the global economic landscape is now reshaping and the big shifts that are occurring and the growing reality that the new normal that we are slowly moving into will be very different to what we have believed to be normal in recent decades. The risk of trade fragmentation, the risk of a debate and change in relation to the nature of globalization really matters to us because we're so open and because we are so trade intensive. So this points from a government perspective to what we need to do. Again, this report provides a very fair commentary into our actions in this area. We have to control the controllables. We have to influence what we can directly influence. look at the decisions that we can take in relation to infrastructure, how we spend the money that we have, ensuring that we get better value for money, looking at the progress that we've made in human capital, but looking at how we can enhance the learning and quality of all that our people can bring to the workplace in the time ahead. The report also acknowledges the work that we've done, but clearly the immense challenges that await with regard to climate change. Yes, we did see greenhouse gas emissions decrease by 6.8% in 2023. It's the lowest that it has been in 3 decades. It's below the 1990 baseline, but we have to reduce them by 51% by 2030. So we have so much more work to do. And as we are doing that work, what will always matter to me is our economic stability, the quality of our public finances. The report acknowledges the really important work that we have done with regard to the Future Ireland Fund, the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund, our efforts to put budget surpluses into them, a project that myself and Minister Chambers are absolutely committed to. But the report reminds us of why we need to do this. The costs of demographic, the fact that those costs can and will grow, and the need for us to build up resilience to deal with that. And as we look at the progress that does need to be made, it's then so appropriate that the survey provides a full chapter to focus in on our challenges with regard to housing and links progress on housing to where we are with national competitiveness. And on that note then of competitiveness and in a world that is changing, that I will conclude. We are in a world that has become more uncertain. There's no room for complacency, but I remain confident that if we make the right decisions, we can compete harder, we can retain our position as an attractive place to invest in and create a job in. But where we are with our housing, where we are with infrastructure, where we are with the resilience of our economy are the policy areas that will enable that progress, and the OECD has rightly made that connection. While we stand today in good shape, we absolutely know that national economic success with the challenges that await cannot be and is not a given. The global economy is changing, we are changing, so we need to continue to prepare for it and build up resilience for those challenges. That means we have to look at new technologies, have to exploit opportunities, and then deal with challenges that await. What this survey does is it doesn't just describe those challenges, it also offers potential solutions. It's why the OECD is so important. It's why our relationship with them matters. And this report and that relationship is a vital piece of our policy architecture and provides today a really important input and template into policy making that I expect and I'm confident will be studied by all economic policy makers in our country. So thank you, Alvaro. Thank you to the OECD, and I look forward to a good discussion on this report.
Minister, thank you very much for those excellent words. I've been told to treat this like an ice cream cone, and I did say I'm not a regular eater of ice cream cones, so people wave at me if you're not hearing at the back. I think, Minister, you said something which resonates with me very strongly. As a country, as a small country, we look out. One of my experiences has been is that big countries don't look out, small countries do. And that's becomes really valuable then when you have international organizations like the OECD, to which you can then cross-refer to so many other countries. So there is something about being small that means we used to look across the water, then we looked to the EU, and now we look more globally. And I think there's a huge amount of learning from that. And what's great about the OECD's work is really where it does the analysis and points out things, makes, as you call them, I think in your presentation, them potential solutions. Not the only solutions, because I think we need to identify ourselves with those solutions, but they basically trigger that openness. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Alvaro Pereira, who's going to present the summary of the report. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure being here, and Minister, with Minister Donohoe, well, and everybody from the Ministry of Finance as well. In particular, it's very interesting for me to be in Ireland because you said that it's a small country, but it's much bigger than you that sometimes you portray yourselves in many ways. Ireland is an example to the world of good policy making over the years. If you go back 3-4 decades ago, and if you read books and articles 3-4 decades ago, and how people perceived Ireland, and what were the prospects for Ireland, I think very few people would understand that a huge economic miracle would take place in this country, with significant increases in standards of living, and with rates of growth that have been the envy to the world. I can say that because I'm also originally from a very small country, Portugal. And for us, and I was in government before, and when I was in government, and even before I went to government, the model that I wanted to follow and I argued for many, many years was Ireland. So in spite of all the challenges that you've been having throughout the years, and all countries have challenges, I think the Irish people should be very proud what you've been accomplishing over the last few years. And they should be very proud in terms of the good policy making. Then you continue to have and examples that they have for the world. You were mentioning the funds and thinking about how can we address some of the big issues that I'll talk about that many countries of the world face. And again, Ireland is giving the example of good policy making. I'll explain why in a second. So it's a great pleasure to be here to launch the Economic Survey of Ireland, the new one. As I said, we do this every 2 years. And I would like to thank my team, in particular Mugi, Patricio, and Vincent, for doing this report. So let me just walk you through what are the main conclusions that we have. So first of all, the Irish economy, as I said, continues to be resilient in face of external shocks. This graph basically tells you that there's been a very strong job creation and has driven also the domestic demand. If you think about, as the minister was mentioning, we have historically low unemployment and historically high employment rates in Ireland. And so very strong labor market. And despite GDP volatility driven by some multinational dominated sectors, the domestic economy remains robust. So we think that is important to say that modified domestic demand, the national indicator that excludes large transaction of foreign corporations that do not have a big impact on the domestic economy, continues to grow strong, as you'll see. And we forecast that the next couple of years, you're going to have, again, strong performance in the economy. Another issue that I think has been worried about, a lot of people worried in the past few years, was inflation. We know that first, after the pandemic, there were some, not only in Ireland, but all across the world, some bottlenecks related to the pandemic that led to a rise in inflationary pressures. Then afterwards, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we had the largest energy crisis since the 1970s, and the largest energy crisis certainly in Europe and in Asia. And in spite of this, we were able to bring inflation down quite substantially. And you can see that in Ireland, inflation also came down quite significantly, even though it's important to say that service price inflation, right now, average inflation will be around 1.5%. But service price inflation continues, like in many other countries, continues to be what economists call sticky. So it's not coming down as fast as we would like. And this is the source of, we need to monitor what will happen so that to see whether service price inflation will continue to go down. These are our forecasts for this year. As you see, growth is set to be robust. We projected that modified domestic demand will grow around 3% in 2025 and 2.7% in 2026. GDP figures are, as you can see, slightly different, but very strong too. So if you put things into perspective, as I said, I follow more than 60 countries directly. I don't see these figures, especially in a country as developed as Ireland, very often, okay? The Irish economy right now is very robust, continues to have very solid growth, unemployment very low, as I said, and inflation slightly below this year, 2% in 2025 and 26 as well. So what are the main priorities that we think that Ireland should focus on in the next few years? First of all, it's absolutely essential to ensure long-run fiscal sustainability. I'll talk also about housing affordability and about climate challenges, but I'll start with the long-run fiscal sustainability. So let me start first with the good news. The fiscal position of Ireland right now is currently strong, with buoyant revenues and budget surpluses. This is obviously an enviable position but can lower the efficiency of a prioritization of expenditures. Fiscal prudence is needed given the medium-term pressures from aging costs, infrastructure and housing gaps, but also defense and climate change. Just to give an idea, just if you focus only on aging. So first of all, good news. We are all aging, and on average, all across the world, we are gaining a lot of life expectancy. Just to give an idea, in the last 25 years around the world, we gained more than 4 to 5 years of additional life expectancy. All of us, on average, have now a possibility of living healthier lives 4 or 5 years, okay? So these are the good news. Good news too, if you think about when we built our social security, our education systems in the post-war era, good news that we used to work until 55 or 60. We would die at 65, and that was it. Right now, the fastest growing age group is 100 plus, growing at 15% a year. Not only that, especially the youngest, but not only so youngest, to get to 80 or 90 is not going to be a surprise. Before, remember, in the time that most of us were born, getting to 100 was almost impossible to think, or when we celebrated, my gosh, this person got to 100. It was newspaper news. Right now, it's becoming very common. And we're living to 80, 90. We have more than 70 to 80% chance of getting to 80, 90, and often with healthy lives. What does this mean? Well, in the old days, if we live until 65, retire at 60, not a big deal. Not a big problem in terms of aging costs, not a big problem in terms of health or pensions. But now imagine that you retire at 60 or 65 and you live until 100 or even 90. What does this mean? First of all, you have to decide yourself what you're going to do for 30 or 40 years. That's very important because obviously you can be a retiree for 40 years, but will you get bored or not? Well, but a possibility is that perhaps when you get to 50, 50-something or 60, you might think of changing your career. So something that we like that is happening in Ireland and you should invest more is lifelong learning, to give possibilities that if people, instead of having a midlife crisis, they have middle life opportunities to change their lives and to be able to start their careers that they always started. Minister likes books. I love books too. And one thing potentially, it's after you retire, hopefully it will not be so soon from public service, you'll be able to write your books and that sort of thing. So, and other people do pursue what they want. So this is the good news. The bad news or the challenge is we also know that there's going to be significant aging costs. So if these are not addressed, just in Ireland is going to be one of the largest aging costs of the OECD. We estimate that it's 5.7% of GDP. It's a huge number, okay? So you need to prepare for this, and you need to tackle issues regarding pensions, healthcare, and taxes too. So that's why we think that even though right now we have a robust fiscal situation, you need to prepare for the future, and you need to take into account these aging costs that will come. So even though you have a surplus now, you have fiscal prudence is very important. That's why we like the funds that were established exactly to tackle these issues are absolutely essential so that you are able to address these issues going forward. A key priority is also to avoid the pro-cyclical expansion in the current expenditures while meeting capital investment needs. In this context, the introduction of a domestic spending rule and the creation of 2 long-term savings funds are welcome. However, the rule has been breached sometimes, and since its introduction, partly reflecting spending overruns. We have the graph here, spending overruns in terms of health, especially in the health sector. More binding fiscal guardrails to complement the EU rules with improved fiscal framework. Comprehensive expenditure reviews linked to the budget process can help deliver spending efficiency gains. In the health sector, we also believe that the plans to shift from a hospital-based healthcare to one that integrates primary, community, and long-term care should be swiftly implemented. Also, another issue that I think is very important is to the graph basically tells you that right now corporate income taxes are very important in the overall tax base for Ireland. And in fact, in terms of corporate income taxes, just 3 companies account for a substantial share of these corporate income taxes. So there's room to improve the medium-term resilience of tax revenues. Corporate tax revenues have risen sharply, as some of these revenues are potentially transitory and are concentrated. As I said, with 3 firms accounting for 38% of total corporate tax revenues in 23, there is a need to ensure diverse and stable revenue sources to finance spending priorities in the medium term. So broadening the tax base could include personal income and value-added taxes reform. So, for example, one thing that is never popular around countries, but we emphasize this, you have several reduced rates in Ireland, and perhaps taking into account, perhaps you might not be a bad idea that you try to review this, whether you need so many reduced rates, or is there anything you can do to enlarge the base. The same thing for personal income. The second priority is to improve the business environment. Remember, you've been so successful in the past 3-4 decades exactly because you've been able to get a really good business environment. But the most important thing is that you cannot let go. You have to be always with a reformist attitude and to be able to try to improve even further in terms of the business environment. And one of the issues that we talk about is labor shortages. In terms of labor shortages, the OECD just very recently produced surveys for firms, labor shortages in 36 countries, Ireland included. And I can tell you that besides, I'll talk about this graph in a second, but those surveys of 36 countries show that Ireland has the second highest labor shortages in construction of the OECD and has the highest labor shortages in industry. So industry and construction, you have some of the highest labor shortages in spite of very fast population growth. And also in health, you have very significant labor shortages. So if you compare Ireland with all these countries, you have very, very large labor shortages. So the planned investments in housing, digital and green transformations, infrastructure and healthcare are critical for the future competitiveness and long-run growth. And as I said, vacancy rates, which is in this graph, have recently been declining, but remain above pre-pandemic levels and especially high in the public sector. So you have public sector, health, construction, and industry with very acute labor shortages. So you need to address them. In terms of some of the labor shortages, as I mentioned, vocational training and training for the low-skilled, unemployed, and inactive is key. And we think this is something that we covered in our survey. One way to address labor shortages is further boosting female employment rates, even though now have reached record highs, but still there's a lot of part-time work and there's more could be done to further boost employment rates of women with flexible work arrangements and increase in child care subsidies, which continue to be fairly high in Ireland. Nevertheless, the high cost of childcare remains a barrier for some groups to enter work for longer hours. Making such support more targeted would also help. Another issue that I would like to highlight is that lengthy court proceedings and high legal costs can also reduce competitiveness. Competition-enhancing reforms, easing the setting up of multidisciplinary practices can help lower legal costs, and the efficiency of case management and planning in the court systems should also be boosted. So this is an area we think that is quite important so that you continue to be a country that has a good business environment. The topic that we know that everybody's talking about in Ireland, and this is the topic that not only is affecting Ireland, but many other countries. If you think about Canada, Australia, many Southern European countries, housing affordability is by far the most important issue that people are talking about. Partly because, especially younger people, I think about my own kids. Can they afford to have a house? They're not in Ireland. They're somewhere else. But also because housing prices went up fairly dramatically in many countries. So we know that after the financial crisis, housing investment did not keep up with the pace of population. You can see in this graph that you have housing stock on green, and yellow is the population growth. You can see that after the financial crisis, population growth vastly outpaced housing investment. So we welcome recent policy measures which have increased housing completions, but continuing imbalances between housing supply and demand are reflected in high house prices and rents. A wide mix of measures is needed to boost supply, and so let me concentrate on a few of these. But important is going to be in the next few years, as I think has been identified by the government, is supply, supply, supply. You need to increase vastly the supply of housing in this country. So an accurate assessment of housing, just change the slide, sorry. Okay. An accurate assessment of the housing needs is crucial for policy design. The recent increase in annual housing target is welcome. However, planning permissions do not always translate into home completions due to judicial reviews and viability challenges, especially in urban areas where demand is high, like in this city in Dublin. The availability of fully serviced residential zone land in the correct locations should also be ensured to meet housing targets. On the other hand, high construction costs, notably for apartments in urban areas, and low productivity in the construction sector. We have a dramatic graph in the survey that show that construction productivity, the productivity of the construction sector is one of the lowest of the OECD in this country. So high construction costs and low productivity in the construction sector decrease the efficiency of housing investment. The lack of standardization and lack of and scale due to fragmentation are the main drivers. And so regularly assessing the drivers of relatively high Irish construction costs, easing regulations with respect to size and specifications of units, and increasing adoption of modular housing would help. Also, the provision of social housing is expanding but has not kept up with the needs, leading to long waiting lists and rising numbers of people experiencing homelessness. There's a need to improve the efficiency and sustainability of social and affordable housing, and the current social housing funding model should be reassessed to diversify sources of finance and lower the dependence on the private rental market. And so a higher supply of social housing combined with streamlined allocation processes can also help combat homelessness. The final issue is the climate transition. I'll talk mostly about mitigation, but also we talk about adaptation. We know that temperatures are rising in Ireland. Ireland is one of the many parts of Ireland are vulnerable to sea level rises, so adaptation is going to be absolutely key. But we know that Ireland has well-developed mitigation and adaptation frameworks, and they include legislated targets of cutting greenhouse gases emissions by 51% from 2019 to 2030, and climate neutrality by 2050. But also Ireland has some sectoral carbon budgets. However, the speed of implementation and compliance with sectoral limits should be improved to meet intermediate targets. In particular, electricity demand is rising, reflecting population growth, data centers, electrification of heating and transport, and so it's important to accelerate the renewables. And renewable electricity generation has risen to 44% in 2023, which is above the OECD average, but is well below the target of 80%. We also talk about the mix of policy tools for the green transition, and we think that it's quite important to have more consistent pricing of emissions. You can see in this graph that you have carbon taxes, especially in the road, but the road sector, but many other sectors, like it happened in other countries, there's not a lot of carbon pricing. And so this is an area we think that it could be working on a little bit further. So let me just sum up what we concluded here. So first of all, Ireland continues to have a very robust economy. And we forecast in the next few years, the Irish economy will continue to do very well. And so, as I said, I follow more than 60 countries directly, and it's rare to see, especially a country with this level of income that is doing so well. Okay? This is possible because of the strength of the business environment in this country and the good policies that Ireland has been pursuing in the past few years. Still, we think that it's very important to maintain fiscal prudence. You might say, okay, we have a surplus and we are doing great in terms of the economy, so listen, let's spend it out. I would not advise you to do that for two reasons. First of all, when the economy is doing very well, and if you use a lot of fiscal stimulus, very likely you'll end up with a lot more inflation, and very likely you end up with trouble. I'll give you an example of Chile. During the pandemic, they decided the economy was okay, it's starting to recover, mostly because of copper and many things. But they decided to spend about 17% of GDP, use their pension funds, and stimulate the economy. Well, they had very large inflation rates that have been very difficult to be able to bring down, okay? So when you spend a lot in a period that you do well, very often that calls out for trouble. The second issue is what you need to do to prepare. There's increasing demand to spend on climate, on defense, and the aging costs. Just on aging, remember, 5.7% of GDP is almost 6% of GDP. It's one of the largest. I think only Slovenia or Slovakia is higher than Ireland. And so you need to prepare for this. So that's why it's so important that that fiscal policy continues to be prudent. And that's so important that the funds that you've established will be a cornerstone of public policy going forward, continuing to strengthen the fiscal framework. The final part is supply, supply, supply in terms of housing. It's absolutely essential to accelerate the supply of housing, and it's absolutely essential to implement the plans that have been designed. Affordability is an issue for many families, and so that's why housing is such an important topic when we talk with our families and friends, or when you talk with your families and friends in Ireland. And finally, preparing for the future also has to do, how can you prepare for the green transition using the opportunities? So all these topics we talk about in the economic survey, so looking forward now for the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very succinct presentation of what is a long report that I commend all of you to have a look at. I'm one of the lucky older folk who's got a copy, a paper copy, but for the rest of you, there's copies online and there's ways of accessing it, which I encourage you to use. I think what this shows is how the OECD brings a number of issues together at a point in time. They're not issues we don't know about, and that's not to say that you're rediscovering the wheel, but you're bringing them together in a way that I think gives a new echo. So the fiscal sustainability issue, and the reality is it's very hard for a government when it has money in the coffers and pressures outside to actually maintain the tightness of the fiscal rules. It's very, very difficult to do. You mentioned in the report about healthcare, and I think it's a crucial area for saving costs into the future, given the aging population. We've kind of known those issues for a long time, but they're now back on the agenda, and I think it's very good to have seen them in this particular presentation. I think lifelong learning is something we haven't done as much of because we've had people longer at school, so we haven't had to. But now we've got technologies that have come out since people have long since finished school and college, and there are other things that they need to learn. So there's a direction there that I think we need to go. So it's really fantastic to see a number of these threads brought together, and if you like, repeating messages coming from this outside view, but reflecting what it is that we're finding inside. So thank you very much for that. Now we're going to have each of the panel to say a few words, and they've got 5 minutes each. And I have a bell, which I'm going to be merciless on. I was our two speakers before. I went very slightly over. The minister was on the button, so we want to have very good explanation. I've never had a lot to say, as are the ministers. So we're going to start with Martina Lawless from the ESRI, who's going to say a few words on her response to the report.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And I'd obviously like to start by congratulating the OECD for their excellent report. Their work, I think, provides a lot of insights that are very valuable as we sort of navigate various complexities for our economic landscape. As Alberto touched on, and as Francis said, the report is extremely wide-ranging, so I won't attempt, out of fear of Francis's bell, to cover all of the points it makes, but just to pick up on a couple of really the key themes. So the kind of first element that they really emphasize is this idea of the importance of fiscal sustainability for the country, and that's based on a foundation of economic sustainability. And right now our economy is obviously facing quite a lot of challenges. Many of those are external, over which we've kind of very little control, although we need to kind of think about how we would deal with them or respond as they arrive. But we also have a lot of kind of challenges and risks that are coming from domestic pressures. And these are the ones where I think, therefore, we have a bit more control. And And therefore, we need to really focus on addressing those to strengthen their economic and fiscal frameworks, so we're more robust as the potential external shocks come towards the economy. The one that the report really focuses on, particularly both in the economic section, but also particularly in the housing special chapter, is on the infrastructural deficits that the economy is really facing at the moment. Linking this to the fiscal framework, I think there's perhaps throughout a sort of controversial kind of proposal there. You don't quite say that maybe the fiscal anchor should be different for current spending than for capital spending. Tight rein put on current spending to allow for some of the investment, but that's maybe an idea for the discussion and the shape of the sort of fiscal framework. Now, while economists, obviously, we always talk about risks, when it comes to infrastructure, I think maybe we've been too risk averse and too cautious in this country for a long time. If we look at how population projections have emerged, if you go back to the 1980s and look at the various iterations of population projections that have been put forward, they've basically consistently undershot where the economy has actually gone to. And this sort of undershooting of projections, or this caution in how we look forward, has maybe been one of the key drivers of our kind of infrastructural deficits that have developed now. We've been very cautious about certainly how rapidly the economy grew in the 1990s, how rapidly it recovered from the financial crisis. I think, and this is fantastic. This is one of the strengths of the Irish economy. It's been incredibly robust in the face of a lot of really substantial shocks, particularly the Minister mentioned the three big shocks of the last number of years, and yet the economy is one of the strongest growing across the OECD. But then we've held back on investing in infrastructure because of the caution in forward looking. I was just thinking of, the obvious examples are in the projects that we haven't progressed, like maybe Metro and so on. But even if you look at projects that did get developed, I was looking back at some coverage of when Dublin Airport's Terminal 2 was opened in 2010, it was declared to be a complete white elephant. There was no way the country needed an airport that size. Now, Alberto will have flown in there perhaps this morning and not have seen a huge amount of excess capacity, not being used in that airport. So I think we kind of need to let some of the fears of large projects, be put to one side and be ambitious in what infrastructure is needed, because a lot of these infrastructural developments then are potentially holding back the competitiveness of the economy, and particularly both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of public amenities and public services. They're also putting pressures on businesses. So there's a sort of like a loop that the OECD kind of draw attention to, whereby the underinvestment in infrastructure and public services are putting cost pressures on businesses. And obviously in terms of the grid and water, that's true both for the foreign direct investment multinational sector, but to a large extent, they're very productive, they're international businesses, they're able to adapt and pay the higher wages that their workers need to deal with kind of higher rents and so on. So they're having much greater pressures on the domestic, the SME sectors, who are finding it much more difficult to kind of keep up with the price pressures that come from, in some ways, these infrastructural deficits. And obviously, Frances in her National Competitiveness Council role will that's Frances and her bell. So I didn't get to my last point, which was build, supply, supply, supply. And I just totally would echo both the welcoming that the OECD made of the updating of the housing targets. I think the next crucial step is that they cascade down to county development plans and local area plans as rapidly as possible. Those are still all based on the 2016 numbers, and that needs to be done incredibly rapidly. And in terms of final point, Frances, those local plans should be taken much more seriously. The certainty in planning permissions. If you're put in planning permission for a project that's in line with the local development plan, there should not be such uncertainty about planning permissions. And that would be a really quick step, controversial one perhaps, to getting the supply unlocked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And having looked at some planning issues last year and what we were doing on the Competitiveness Council, it's really very clear that the lack of certainty in the system is a huge drag the economy and on the decisions to invest. And I think getting the right scale back again for some of the builders is a fairly crucial one, which has been mentioned a lot in the recent past. So Dr. Mugadale McGowan, would you like to say a few words? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. I'll be brief because Alvaro covered all the main messages, but I thought I could say a few things about housing that already you mentioned. I think in terms of the supply, the planning is the most crucial element in the 2022 survey. That was our key recommendation. And now there's a new planning act, which we very much welcome. But we note that its effective implementation will depend on swiftly deploying the secondary regulations and having enough planners both at the central and the local government level. And also it increased digitalization of data to improve the case management of planners. Second, I would like to say that when we prepared the housing chapter, we met many stakeholders. It was fascinating, and everyone has different perspectives, as can be expected. But I think everyone had the same common message that frequent and large-scale changes to the fiscal and regulatory framework just creates investment uncertainty, and that's something that people would like to see avoided. And third, now the government is a big actor in the housing sector, and the number of schemes, the fiscal costs are increasing. So it's important to have value for money for public investment in housing. And in this sense, we felt like that different data sources give different results on aspects of the housing market, like especially the rental market, for example. Is there enough, or what's happening? So to design the best policies, we think that there should be improvement in the data about housing, and that these different databases from different places should be combined. So I'll stop there before the bell.
Thank you very much. And I didn't even have to touch the bell. So this is definitely a learning occasion. I think it's one of the things that it didn't feature in the report, as from what I could see with my very quick look at it last night, is the work that the OECD has been doing on housing with these very big international projects. And that involves looking, not the people looking at housing being the usual suspects, but also being more the architects and planners and engineers, because really we're talking about different ways of living. And the scale of what most countries require in the OECD is huge. For us, it's enormous. But that notion of having a wider group of people in at the very beginning, co-designing, I think is something which the OECD seems to have learned from. And I think there's a lot of material I've seen on the website, which I think is hugely valuable to people in Ireland who are in that sphere. So final speaker is John McCarthy from the Department of Finance. Love to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Frances. And like others, just to thank the OECD team. Really a pleasure working with them. I think our engagement began about a year ago on this report, so it's great to see the culmination of all this work really in an analytically strong and empirically rich piece of analysis today. Maybe just three brief points from me: one on the near term, one on the medium term, and then unsurprisingly one on the public finances. On the near term, obviously it's not the focus of the report, it's more structural in nature. But just to say, I think your near-term assessment is very similar to that of the department. I do notice the title of chapter 1 is Resilience is in the chapter, and I think that's really crucial because of what we've been through over the past couple of years. I was just Googling some of the COVID kind of sequencing, and if you look at it, tomorrow, 5 years ago, was the first death in Europe on foot of COVID. 2 weeks before that, we had the UK leaving the European Union. The pandemic then, and then people have mentioned the energy price shock. But what wasn't mentioned then was the sort of most aggressive monetary policy tightening really in a generation. And the economy has really come through those. A combination of supportive budgetary policy, of monetary policy, but also the inherent flexibility. Alvaro, I think this is the point that you were making about the sort of business environment and the economy as well. And I think the overall kind of takeaway from me from that kind of first chapter is there has been really no scarring of the economy. I think that's a positive. I think it's important, of course, that we avoid complacency, because I do think we're all aware that there are shocks or potential shocks coming down the line. Secondly, then maybe on the medium term and looking at the economy from a supply side perspective, so focusing on inputs rather than on outputs. And if you look at where sort of from a growth accounting perspective, you break down the growth in GNI star into its constituent parts over the past 10, 15 years, I think you can see the bulk of the increase in incomes is coming from more labour utilisation. So as others have mentioned, the employment ratio is at a historical high. Participation rates, especially female participation rates, historically high. These are all positive developments. But maybe what's less positive really, and the report touches on this, is that productivity hasn't been particularly strong over the past 10, 15 years. It has really been maybe an employment miracle rather than a productivity miracle. And, you know, from where we're going, and this comes back to the point that Alvaro would have made on demographics, etc., where we're going, where we'll have demographic headwinds really kicking in from about 10 years' time, if they're not offset by a kind of reversal in this weakness of productivity, we will really be looking at a fairly substantial easing in the trend growth rate of the economy, with implications, of course, for tax revenue, for spending, etc. And the report does touch on this, talking about trying to close the gap between maybe the frontier firms and then the sort of long tail of less productive firms. In fact, the previous iteration of this report went into this in a lot more detail, and was a really good piece of analysis. Finally, then on the public finances, I mean, I think it's really useful that the report highlights some of the short-term vulnerabilities, but I think the medium-term vulnerabilities are really crucial. I think it's important to plan for those. I mean, when I'm talking about the medium-term vulnerabilities, I mean, in the department, we often refer to them as the 4Ds. People here will be conscious of what they are, but Alvaro, you mentioned the sort of by 2050, I think it is, or maybe 2060, sort of 6% of GDP will be the cost of demographics. Even within the next 2 years, it'll be 10 years, it'll be 2% of national income. So these demographic costs are really coming at us thick and fast. On the other Ds, then the cost of decarbonisation, and there's been a lot in the media about this over the last while. I mean, we've done some work in the department on the revenue side, looking at the cost of moving away from fossil fuel consumption and what it might mean for excises and some of the other taxes that are reliant on fossil fuel consumption. We would be looking at, you know, if we were to move to carbon neutrality straight away, the loss of about 5 billion sooner rather than later. The third D then is kind of digitization and sort of the fiscal costs associated with smoothing that digital transition. And then finally, you know, global fragmentation, deglobalization, etc. Moving from a first best world where trade and investment are undertaken on the basis of comparative advantage to a second best world where trade and investment are undertaken on the basis of geopolitical factors and what that might mean for the economy and the public finances. Thanks, Frances.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. So, John, just reflecting on your 4Ds, Alvaro stuck in another D there when you weren't watching, or maybe you were watching or listening and didn't want to mention it, but he did mention the defence word.
I heard it.
Which is, you know, 4Ds might become 5Ds, which makes the problem a larger one. I think you're right. I mean, the ability we've responded very well with employment. And if you like the productivity, if you break down the productivity figures, they're very strong in the FDI sector, not so much in the SME sector. But the SME sector is where we're getting the big bulk of employment. So there is a sense in terms of managing that balance as we go forward. So I'd like now to open the floor for questions, if I could. I'm going to take a few questions at a time, and I'd like you to state who you'd like them to go to, so that and they're going to be very brief, because the bell will come out again if they're not very brief. And I'd like to say 2 or 3, and then I'll look to see online if there are some questions as well. So let me start looking for the back. There's some gentleman here with glasses at the back. Yep.
Name's Eamon Quinn. It's for the OECD. I'm just wondering whether the report is not an election too late in terms of recommendations for VAT, for broadening the tax base, and for housing tax credits. Apologies, right. I suppose on a lighter note, would you, second question is briefly, would you have the OECD have any tips meeting a potential US president next, for any government ministers meeting the US president next week in the White House, next month in the White House, relating to tariffs, etc.?
Thank you. To a very quick one on the back of it, and same lines. All your assumptions and reports seem to be based on still globalizing kind of world. As we shift from that, how serious, Draghi said Europe has an existential problem. So how, from the OECD point of view, how worried are you that this may all end up in no value if things go the way that they're going? And last, there's been a lot of criticism about data such as GDP, that it's all very quantic and it's all very material based, without, like, a country can have great GDP numbers, but maybe a very high suicide ratio or a very high consumption of fossil fuels. Is the OECD revising the way in which data is computed along those lines?
Yeah, Ronan Tynan, you keep talking about a demographic cost, but I think the Chief Economist of the OECD did offer some innovative perspectives, shall I say. And I just want to put it to the Minister that it's a fascinating way perhaps of addressing it, because over a 5-year term of government, for example, if there was a huge emphasis on public health, I want to put this question to you, obviously, getting people to think about their lifestyles, an emphasis on health prevention or disease prevention, because most of health costs are lifestyle. But if we ignore that, we're just facing what will be a huge, because health, unfortunately, has a tendency to run completely out of control. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Nora Owen, who's happily reaching that age that Alvera talked about. I'll be 80 in 4 months. But could I just ask you, have we a structural problem in Ireland for Paschal as Minister for Finance to actually set up a proper section in the department to deal with the 60 to 90-year-old phase of life that you've put out? And have we a structural problem? Because an awful lot of our services are provided by charities. And so they get donations, but then nothing structural sometimes happens to provide for older people, particularly, say, in the area of dementia and that. So I just wondered, have we reached a point now, because of people living longer, that we need to look how we deliver public policy on health?
And I have a question online from Tom Ferris, who's an IIEA member, and it's directed at Martina Lawless, asking whether she would agree that the requirements that capital projects have to meet under the government's infrastructure guidelines are too onerous, and that is what's delaying the delivery of completed infrastructure. So I'll let Martina think about that for the moment. So just before we take those 5 questions, just one which I don't know whether Alvaro and the Minister would like to comment on, but I presume a lot of the work on this report was done during 2024 and was being finished up at the end of 2024. And there have been certain developments since the end of 2024, which have caused us to look at the world in a way that's somewhat challenging. And I suppose two things that come out of that. One is the extent to which I guess the role of the OECD in the context of more of a gap between what maybe the European members would have been thinking about previously and what the American government is seeming to be directing itself. And I suppose the other issue then is the extent to which both of you would think that the European compass is actually, competitiveness compass is actually going to help us to actually, to narrow that gap, if you like. In other words, that some of the issues being sought by the competitiveness compass will actually help to put us more into a context where dealing with the United States might be less challenging. So, Minister, if I could start with you on that.
Okay, Francis, thank you. And thank you to all the audience members for the questions that they have put to me and put to the panel. So just to deal with the questions that were put to me there by Francis. So I believe the competitive compass that was published by the European Commission there just over a week ago offers a very clear roadmap regarding how Europe can deepen its own economic foundations so that we are in a position to be better able to deal with the policy challenges that may emerge from other parts of the world. And I would in particular highlight the higher focus that the compass puts on a savings and investment union and the role that that will have not only in supporting investment within Europe, but on the euro, and some of the thinking that is in the competitive compass also regarding the future of the budget of the European Union, which of course Ireland will be playing an important role in our presidency in the second half of 2026. In relation to the very important question there that was put regarding demographic change, is it a cost or is it a benefit? And of course it's both. Since when have we begun to say that living longer is a bad thing? Living longer is an extraordinary gift that has been bestowed upon us by science, by good policy decisions, and then by those who are in a position to do so, taking decisions regarding their own life and health. And I see it as an unqualified success that we're all going to be able to enjoy each other's company for a little longer. That, of course, does bring costs with it. Let me acknowledge them very clearly before I make the point around the benefit. And my own judgment is the very early phase of those costs are now manifesting themselves in some of the funding challenges that we are facing for our health services. That it's not just the issues that we've been familiar with for many years regarding budget management. There are deeper issues afoot regarding the demand that those who are old, who did not have normal access to our health services for nearly 2 years, and the needs that they now have. But then the benefits are just unbelievable in terms of people's willingness and interest in working for longer, what that means then to the contribution that they can make to our economy and the taxes they pay, on the goods and services they buy, and also their willingness to look after their own pension arrangements as they live for longer. So huge benefits there, but I think it's very fair to say that perhaps in our public debate on that, we're not giving that side of the equation the policy prominence that it needs. But to give you maybe a bit of confidence that we're thinking about it, very shortly, the Department of Finance is going to be, and I will be bringing forward a publication laying out our own thoughts on the long-term demographic change within Ireland, and us as a department giving our assessment of it as well. And we're actually concluding that project, and John can speak a bit about it too. And then just in terms of the OECD timeliness, in relation to the points that they make about the broadening of the tax base, I would point to the efforts that we have made in carbon taxation that are nearly without peer across Europe at the moment, particularly as continuing to go ahead with carbon tax changes during an energy-led inflation shock. And I would point to the commitments that we have regarding the future of PRSI as really good examples of how we have either broadened the tax base or are committed to doing it. That means that the OECD report continues to be very timely. And as the nature of globalization does change, and those changes could be more imminent than we suspected, I do think the work that the OECD report includes on the value of resilience, for me, is at the heart of all of this. Because resilience is not about being rigid as policymakers or as a policy architecture. Because if you're rigid with lots of change happening around you, you run the risk of just getting capsized. It's really resilience as a foundation that then helps us be agile. And John has touched on the greatest example of that agility, which is during the pandemic, what we did very, very quickly. And don't foresee that scale of action again, but over time, having the resilience will help us deal with changes in our global economy.
Alvaro, would you like to comment on the questions that came in your direction, the taxation, when the minister has got him his retaliation in first? But you might like to say
Hardly retaliation. Oh my God, Francie. You've seen me in retaliation mode, and that wasn't it now.
But the other issues, I suppose, the globalization, the continuing sort of, if you like, I mean, despite John's having the de-globalization as one of the issues, but there is a sense in which it's very hard to see things very differently in a globalized framework. And then my own question about I guess the OECD grouping, which spans parts of the world that are now voicing things in a somewhat different way, even if the gap may not be as great as the reality, the rhetoric isn't helpful to progressing things.
Yeah, I think there was a couple of questions as well regarding whether we were too late in terms of our report and so on. Listen, this is something that we've been saying for a while, not only for Ireland, but for other countries. Broadening tax bases is something that we think is quite important, in particular in the context of an aging society. So we've been saying that. But sometimes it just takes time, right? So it's not the first or second time that in certain countries we go, it's politically it's difficult to do some sort of measures, even though they might be, they might be tempting. Sometimes in certain countries, the political economy is not there. I'll give you an example. In many countries, through pension reform is extremely difficult. And the OECD sometimes says for 5, 6, 7 reports in a row, or even more, link life expectancy to retirement ages, because we think this is quite important, make it automatic. This is not the case here, but in certain countries, I was just in Poland, men retire there at 65, women at 60. So there's this decalage between women and men. So, and we say this doesn't make sense because of this and this, but sometimes it just takes a while. So we keep repeating, we'll keep telling you, even though we might be, annoying, I think it's important to tell you the truths, the inconvenient truths. That's our role, and we'll keep doing that. Second, on multilateral system, listen, we know that trade has been one of the driving forces of the world economy in the past few decades. We also know that hundreds of millions of people left poverty, came out of poverty because of trade. This is a country that benefited dramatically because of FDI and because of trade. We think that continuing to have open the channels for trade, continuing to have the channels open for negotiations is key. And we hope that this continues to be in the future. This is what we hope, and whatever we can do to contribute, we'll be there to do that. I would like also to mention a couple of things. First of all, on society, on the aging society, some people, rather than talking the aging cost, the aging society, they call it the longevity society, because really it's really a revolution. If you look at what had happened in the 50s and the 60s compared to now, it was very rare to have people going beyond 80. Now is the norm, and will be increasingly the norm, okay? And so we just need to prepare. So the question is basically, how can we change public policy? Well, we need to change, and we need to learn from each other, because basically we will need to redesign everything that we built in terms of systems after the Second World War. So we need to redesign education systems so that people can recycle themselves, upskill, reskill in the middle of their lives if they want. We need to redesign pension systems because obviously we're going to have a situation in which the working age population will come down dramatically. And replacement rates will be a factor. So basically, we need to prepare for these issues, and we need to redesign tax systems, innovation systems, and so on. We are doing something that is very exciting. I've not seen the results because we're just talking with my team. What about business dynamism? If we have an older society, do we have less business dynamism or not? I don't think so. We are going to hopefully prove, but we're looking at the evidence right now. But this is an area that we need to look at. And so we think we just need to prepare for us to have a longevity society so that people live longer, happier lives, and everybody benefits. I think we need to do that. And we need to work together on this. Just if you give me just one minute to talk about Europe, because I think also the minister was mentioning this. Europe, I think this is a very important time for Europe because this is a time where some of the reforms that Europe has been postponing. Now we have two fantastic reports, the Draghi and the Letta report, but it's time to implement them. In Europe, listen, I was in government 12 years ago or so, and many of the topics that we're talking about Europe still there. Okay, not much has moved. And what do we see? Right now, we have a significant productivity lag between Europe and the United States. The productivity growth in the United States is close to 2.7% right now. Europe is lower than 1%. We just published a paper at the OECD that showed that with AI, the productivity impact is going to be quite significant, between 0.4 and 0.9% of labor productivity, big bump. But it's going to be mostly first in the United States, and Europe will lag. In fact, countries like Italy and France will lag substantially. So the divergence between the United States and Europe will increase. What can Europe do to use this, to be able to overcome these issues? Well, two things, for example, in the single market, transportation networks. The Europeans are talking about 10T corridors, which is linking north and west and east and west, north and south and east and west. But they have not done it. Why isn't Europe doing this? Even in terms of public investment, European public investment. Energy, it's a huge issue here in Ireland and many other countries. The energy grids continue to be not fully integrated, and the market is not integrated. In Europe has been talking about this for a long time. After the energy crisis, there was more, but I think there need to be more. And then the third issue about Europe that the minister was mentioning, the Capitals and Investment Union. Remember, one of the reasons why the United States has firms that are a lot more innovative than the Europeans is that for startups, the capital is there. So for seed capital, it's all fine. But when firms get to the crucial point of getting to 5, 6, 7 years or more to scale up, in the United States, they have venture markets, very large venture markets. They have private equity. They have a lot of possibilities of financing themselves. In Europe, where do you go? Where is the financing? It's mostly bank financing. So I think that here, this is where Europe needs to, in my view, advance a very strong venture market in Europe and be able to bring scaling up of firms in Europe rather than them being lured to the United States and not staying in Europe. But anyway, this is a very important point in time, and I think it's time for Europe to wake up to these issues. It's time, especially for Europe, to deliver.
The failure to progress the capital market union must be one of the, I think it was seen as a kind of an outcome of the rest of Europe kind of working itself through the impact on productivity, the impact on industry and business. I think that wasn't just factored high enough in the priority that wasn't given to it over the period. And it's great to see it being relabeled in the new world, and hopefully will progress very quickly. Because the one thing we can see is that some other countries tend to move a little bit more quickly. What's good is that Europe has got mechanisms at the moment to be able to have the Commission led with the support of countries, which I think is, I'm really very relieved to see that that's there now, because we would have been in difficulty if we didn't have that modus operandi in place. Martina, there was a question for you. Do you want to?
Yeah, so on the infrastructure guidelines, obviously I bet a kind of key point about the infrastructural deficits that we have in the OECD report is very clear on those. But at the same time, that has to be balanced with that we get value for money. So it wasn't a suggestion that all capital projects get the green light immediately. So kind of good evaluation, clear guidelines on what gets funded are really crucial to making sure that, you know, the infrastructure gets developed in a kind of efficient value for money way. There are probably issues with delays in the process. In particular, planning is the obvious one, but in other areas, particularly related to energy, you've got sort of multiple steps in terms of permits and permissions and so on that all have to be done one after another, where, you know, maybe could be done simultaneously as efficiency gains. Also, I didn't mean to suggest that all infrastructure and all capital spending was coming from the state. There's obviously, particularly in the housing deficit, a huge role for the attraction of private capital. And that's really obviously a key kind of proposal of the Housing for All strategy. But getting value for money for the infrastructure that is delivered is important, but making sure that it's adequate and sort of future-proofed for a growing economy and a growing population needs to be balanced out with that. I'd also like to pick up on one question that I think kind of wasn't answered, which was on that, you know, economists tend to look very much at numbers, the lady in the front there. But the Department of Finance always at the annual budget has a very nice beyond GDP report, which very much brings in a wider suite of well-being measures to kind of monitor the progress of the economy and society, much more so than kind of like hanging everything on kind of like a GNI growth number. So that's a great publication and maybe addresses some of the question you had there.
Thank you for coming in on that. I think we're kind of out of time. I'm conscious of the fact that there's two on the panel who haven't got in again, but then two of their colleagues have got in already. So there's a sense in which we've represented. Of course, Martina was recently at the Department of Finance, so I don't know who's running ahead on this one of winning. But listen, there are some other questions that came in online, but I think we need to bring it to a close. Great report, which I recommend to everybody to look at. Delighted that the Minister is here, came, listened, spoke, listened, and also that the OECD did such a fantastic presentation. We look forward to being here again in 2 years' time and seeing what's happened and whether John has now got from 4Ds to 5Ds and what other changes, and whether or not some of the OECD's great work on housing might actually have featured into, because what Martina's just talked about there is housing is inherently very, very complex, and it links in with infrastructure and so many other issues that we really do need to find solutions that are not what we've been doing forever in the past. But thank all of you very much for today, and thank you for the IIEA for hosting this event.